Hello, everyone. We'll get started now. It's exactly 6 o'clock. Trent, if you don't mind just turning off your phone volume, that'd be great. And thanks for joining us. So my name's Kendra, and I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this evening for Canadian Sport Institute Pacific's Sport Performance Speaker Series webinar. We're lucky enough to have our Director of Performance Solutions and Innovation and Research at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, Dr. Trent Stellingwerff, join us this evening during this hectic time in our world to talk to us about energy deficiency. I'm so excited to have you all here to tune in and learn about REDS. Trent will dive deeper into this space as he presents this webinar, so grab your notebooks and a blanket and prepare yourself to learn. For those of you tuning into a live presentation for the first time, welcome. During this presentation, feel free to type in the chat box at any time a question you may have for Trent, and he will try his best to answer them as they come up, or he may have some time at the end to answer any pressing questions. Also, this presentation will be recorded and posted on our on-demand speaker series webpage for those wanting to rewatch anything. Before I hand things over to Trent, I'd like to share with you a bit about him. Since 2011, Dr. Trent Stellingwerff serves as the Director of Performance Solutions, Innovation and Research at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, based out of Victoria, BC. In this role, he directs several different major research projects across different sport performance discipline areas, with several postdocs, PhD, and master's students involved. He is also the Director of Sports Science and Sports Medicine for Athletics Canada. His primary sport and research focus is with physiology and nutrition expertise, primarily to Canada's national track and field team. Trent has more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications in the areas of exercise, physiology, skeletal muscle, metabolism, and performance nutrition and supplementation. Furthermore, he has co-authored 7 book chapters focusing on the role that nutrition can play in supporting elite athlete performance. In 2010, Trent was a lead author and presenter for the International Olympic Committee Consensus Meeting in Nutrition. Over the years, Trent has attended 3 Olympic Games, 4 Commonwealth Games, and 6 World Champions. Now, Trent, thank you so much for joining me today. It's looking like you guys are having some issues with the speakers. Let's just see what's going on here. Still can't hear anything. I can hear you. Tip for future presentation, use Google Hangouts. Thanks, Jordy. Appreciate your tip. I do know that Adobe Connect has been a struggle for us in the past, and I'm definitely going to look at strategizing some new alternative softwares. If you guys are having issues, we will be recording this, and you'll be able to get access after the presentation is complete. So without further ado, Trent, thank you so much again for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. I hope those of you whose speakers are working can hear me okay. Tonight I probably have 25 to 35 minutes of content. What I've tried to do here is really focus on the specifics and basics of what REDS is and isn't. And I've included a few practical examples and a few case studies. I probably have a couple hundred slides in this area, as the topic is very broad, but I've really whittled it down to about 30 slides tonight. I will try my best to speak and ask and answer questions as we go through the chat on the right. My talk tonight is broken up a little bit, and so I'll pause after some sections to just answer questions as well. But let's jump right into this. And I'm going to start with a bit of a provocative statement. And I absolutely love all the therapists that I work with, and a lot of them are indeed magicians. And so there's no disrespect here to our medical staff or paramedical staff who do wonders. But in my humble opinion, there's probably no amount of sports medicine and no amount of therapy that will fix an injured or ill athlete when the athlete has a genetic predisposition for injury. The training loads are not individualized and or inappropriate, so overreaching, overtraining, or just straight up injuries. The athlete is unwilling to get enough and consistent recovery. And under each of these, you can see various references for these points. And finally, the athlete has chronic poor energy availability. Yes, this is absolutely in my top 4, and probably a slowly emerging and very unappreciated smoking gun that can move up this list in terms of importance when it comes to chronic injuries. And so with that background, we're going to jump right into what is REDS. And I think for a lot of people on here, they would say, well, isn't REDS just a new name, a new buzzword for female athlete triad? And it just affects a handful of female endurance athletes and their menstrual cycle and maybe their bones. And I hope after the next 30 or 35 minutes, you'll realize that REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport, is much, much more than this. So I'm going to start with a little bit of science, and we'll start a little bit on the evolution of the science. And let's just start first with the female athlete triad. There is a plethora, there's a ton of research done on this topic, and then I'll show where and how the female athlete triad fits into REDS. So the female athlete triad was first described in 1984 in a high-end medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, where Barbara Drinkwater, who's a former ACSM president, she actually just passed away last year and wrote an editorial on her acceptance of REDS as a concept, published a paper titled Bone Mineral Content of Amenorrheic and Eumenorrheic Athletes. I'm going to use the terms amenorrheic and eumenorrheic throughout. Amenorrheic means an irregular or non-existent menstrual cycle for females, obviously, and eumenorrheic means a normal menstrual cycle every 28 days approximately. And the idea of the female athlete triad was that disordered eating or eating disorders, extreme as anorexia or bulimia, up here on the top right, would lead to delayed menarche or delayed period, and an absence of a menstrual cycle, so menstrual dysfunction, leading to symptoms of osteoporosis or low bone mineral density. Sometimes after this 1984 seminal paper, the Female Athlete Triad Coalition and Working Group extended the evolution of the science to say that there is a continuum between these 3 factors of healthy eating status, healthy menstrual cycles, and healthy bones, leading to overt amenorrhea, disordered eating, and osteoporosis. And that athletes and individuals may be somewhere along that spectrum of the triad. However, there's been an evolution of the science in REDS, and the International Olympic Committee introduced a broader term for a larger, more comprehensive overall syndrome in 2014, which originally had been called the Female Athlete Triad Syndrome. And this is relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. And part of that in 2014, when a large group got together in Lausanne, was the idea that yes, the female athlete triad is incredibly important. The science is robust, or more robust than some of the REDS science, because it's been around since 1984. Yes, female athletes probably have symptoms and outcomes, or deleterious or negative outcomes of REDS that are perhaps more than their male counterparts. But those of us that worked in the field absolutely saw types of REDS symptoms in males, and also suspected that it extended beyond just unhealthy bones. And so the quote in that paper was, the syndrome of relative energy deficiency in sport refers to impaired physiological functioning caused by a relative energy deficiency, and includes, but is not limited to, metabolic rate, menstrual function, bone health, immunity, protein synthesis, cardiovascular health, and performance. And we now have data to represent and show that REDS indeed impacts all of those things, including protein synthesis, including performance. And I'll highlight some of that this evening. So in some ways, you could think about the female athlete triad as the tip of the iceberg, with REDS being the large, unseen at times, much larger piece under the water. And these diagrams here, these circles, were from the 2014 consensus statement. And the circles on the right highlight all the various proposed health consequences of REDS. And you can see here, if I grab my pointer, you can see here the triad fits in here between menstrual function, bone health, and energy deficiency. But you can see decreases in hematological outcomes. I'll show that later. So red blood cells, growth and development, cardiovascular outcomes, gastrointestinal outcomes. But here on the left are the various proposed performance outcomes: decreased endurance performance, increased injury rate, decreased training adaptation, etc., etc. This is still a theoretical model. I want to stress that both the female athlete triad consensus statement and tool that exists to assess it, as well as the REDS consensus statement and the tool that exists to assess that, are not yet validated. Scientific validation takes a long time, but there's enough strong evidence to suggest that there are a lot of incredibly strong correlations to a lot of these outcomes when athletes are underfueling, which is what we'll show tonight. And indeed, REDS not only impacts nutrition, but also sports medicine, physiology, mental performance, strength and conditioning, and even biomechanics. So when we're talking about the evolution of the science, originally we talked about energy balance. And I want to get us away from the concept of energy balance. But I will explain what energy balance is, and then I will explain what low energy availability is. And I would rather all of us speak about low energy availability rather than energy balance, even though the concept of energy balance might make more sense to you. Energy balance is energy intake compared to total energy expenditure throughout the entire day. Total energy expenditure includes basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate. It includes physical activity or training or competition and sport activity. It includes the energy expenditure of just daily living, and it includes the thermic effect of food. And I really want to challenge us, and us as scientists, to say, how easy is it to measure some of these things here in terms of getting total energy expenditure? One thing I want to impress upon you, it is incredibly hard and difficult to measure energy intake accurately. And it is impressively difficult to measure total energy expenditure accurately. It is fraught with over and underestimates. A lot of athletes will over or under report energy intake, or just plain get it wrong in terms of actually accurately measuring and recording what you eat. So we've gone away a little bit from energy balance. The other thing to realize is when an athlete is underfueling, the body compensates very quickly it can be as little as 5 to 7 days by decreasing basal metabolic rate. The body actually starts to shut down a little bit by decreasing basal metabolic rate. So on paper, an athlete could be in energy balance, but actually have poor energy availability because they're in a deficit and their basal metabolic rate is starting to shut off. And basal metabolic rate is incredibly important for turnover and healthy organs, healthy brains, healthy muscles, healthy bones, and everything else that's involved with recovery. So let's move now to the concept of energy availability. Energy availability is energy intake minus just exercise or training-related energy expenditure divided by fat-free mass or muscle mass. So it's a different equation. Energy availability is what's left over to allow the body to function optimally. So if you eat 3,000 calories a day as energy intake, and you're training like a madman, and you expend 3,000 calories a day, you have 0 calories left over for your body to optimally function or recover, or to allow for bone growth, allow for a healthy gut, allow for optimal brain development, allow for organ and tissue turnover. That's an extreme case. But energy availability is what you have left over. In adults, in healthy exercising adults, we know that when you take energy intake and you minus exercise energy expenditure, hopefully you have left over about 45 calories per kg of fat-free mass or muscle mass per day. And when you have that amount left over, which might be about 1,000 or 1,500 calories when you multiply that out, you have enough energy left over for your body to optimally adapt to training and optimally adapt to life. What is nice about energy availability are a couple of things. As scientists, it's actually, even though it's still challenging, it's easier to assess and measure because all we need to assess is energy intake and exercise energy expenditure. We don't have to assess the thermic effect of food or basal metabolic rate or some of those other parameters. And two, intuitively, energy intake and exercise energy expenditure are decisions made by athletes and coaches. You control your energy availability. You don't necessarily control your basal metabolic rate or your thermic effect of food when it comes to energy balance. And so again, energy availability is a more elegant way to think about whether or not there's enough energy left over for optimal adaptation and optimal health. So here's the equation again, energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure divided by fat-free mass or muscle mass. Here on the bottom left are some of the various cutoffs that have been established in strict laboratory studies. This is impressively difficult to do in free-living, free-ranging athletes. And you can see various cutoffs. Interestingly enough, signs and symptoms of low energy availability in men may not be observed until males are chronically under 15 to 20 calories per kg fat-free mass per day, although this cutoff is still emerging and not absolutely solidified yet. I don't want to go into all of these small specific outcomes or ways, but I do want to highlight that there's a multitude of ways, all with various pros and cons, to measure energy intake. There's a multitude of ways to measure exercise energy expenditure. Again, all with various efficacy and various pros and cons. And there's various ways to measure fat-free mass as well. Probably the best methodology are the methods at the bottom. So for energy intake, it's research, measured, weighed, and standardized meal plans. For exercise energy expenditure, it's using double-labeled water tracers, and for fat-free mass, it might be underwater weighing. And the worst method is dietary, are the methods here at the top. So that's for if there's any scientists tuning in and are curious about some of the methods here. But I really want to stress again that males are also human and that this is just not a female problem. In fact, already back in 2005, there was male cyclists that were reported with extremely low energy availability and basically osteoporosis in their bones, as well as jockeys with extremely negative outcomes on health and bone health from low energy availability. So these concepts have been seen in males for sure, and I'll highlight more male data as we go throughout this presentation. So that was my piece on diagnosis, or excuse me, my piece on what REDS is and what energy balance and energy availability is. I'll make a quick pause there and ask if there's any questions about the theory behind REDS before I jump into REDS diagnosis. All right, great. Oh, it says, Don, your slides are ahead of your talk. I have no idea why that is. I'm sorry. So when it comes to REDS diagnosis, these are probably some of the key things to look out for. And so the key things to look out for and the way to measure REDS are probably the secondary indicators. So as coaches or as athletes in the group, these are some of the things, and the things I've highlighted in blue, I think every coach can help to identify as well. So things like dietary restriction, all the way to eating disorders, are a really large red flag for Reds. Constantly striving to be thin year-round is another risk factor. Extremely low body mass indexes of under 17.5 or greater than 5% shifts in body composition in under a month are also indicators. Although certainly in the field, in some instances, we've seen Reds outcomes in body mass indexes much greater than that. The definition of amenorrhea is less than 9 menstrual cycles in the last 12 months. However, already in females, if you're missing 1 or 2 menstrual cycles, I think that is already an emerging red flag, and you should have a discussion with your healthcare provider. Females consistently losing their menstrual cycle while training is not a normal outcome of athletes. It's incredibly impressive how much information our general practitioners need to keep up to speed on. Some of them aren't aware of all the exercise literature, and that's completely fair. But a lack of a menstrual cycle or low testosterone or low sex drive in males is one of the biggest indicators of emerging Reds symptoms. If you're someone that's had 2 or more career stress fractures, and these tend to be overuse stress fractures, these are different than a rugby player that gets hit and breaks a bone or trauma injuries. If you have this data, your bone mineral density and a Z score of under -1, again, is another risk factor. I might add to coaches and athletes, very inconsistent training ups and downs can be an indicator, but not always. Very high levels of consistent fatigue, sleeping a lot, drop off in training or competition performance or a plateau, and poor sex drive or low measured sex hormones. Poor sex drive in male athletes is definitely an emerging factor. In short, I think it's just important that your athletes have a safe space to speak up and talk about how they're feeling, how their fatigue is, whether it's more than normal or less than normal. And these all can be early indicators of Reds. With female athlete triad, there's accumulating risk in A-type individuals or people that get straight A's, as well as just another background risk factor to consider. Now, when it comes to assessing a female menstrual cycle, oral contraceptive can be very challenging. You should not use oral contraceptive to treat Reds. It does not impact bone health long term. And oral contraceptives can actually mask sex hormone assessment if you've done a blood test. Hormone-based IUDs are also the same. In terms of birth control, the only birth control in females where we can actually assess their sex hormones are copper IUDs. And so that can be challenging in the assessment of Reds as well. I just thought I'd raise that. So in 2014, as I said, the IOC consensus statement beyond the female athlete triad developed the Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport CAT, or Clinical Assessment Tool. And this clinical assessment tool I've listed here is a traffic light approach with a green or low risk approach where athletes have healthy eating habits, appropriate energy availability, normal hormonal metabolic function, normal menstrual cycles, normal sex drive, healthy BMD. Athletes may have risk factors for a caution or a yellow light. So again, these are the same or a lot of the majority of risk factors I had on the last slide. So amenorrhea or functional hypothalamic amenorrhea over the last 6 months, abnormal hormone profiles in males, and there's other factors that medical teams can look at. And then there's a high risk group here where it's no start, where even training might be not indicated. Extreme eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, serious medical, psychological, and physiological conditions, and extreme weight loss techniques are all areas where athletes may be taken out of sport, unfortunately. This traffic light approach is now, 6, 7 years old. And indeed, there is a proposal for a bunch of us to meet back up in Lausanne at the IOC headquarters at some point in the next year and work on a version 2 clinical assessment tool. So the CAT for sport concussions, for example, is on version 4. And we definitely need to update this clinical assessment tool for REDS, as I think there's probably a better way to assess this and have a scoring grid and accumulated risk scores and include other methodology as well. So stay tuned. Now, what is the prevalence of REDS in Canadian Olympic sport? In March 2019, I asked every single one of our sport registered dietitians across our Canadian Sport Institute network for some feedback. And we used just a simple score: females with menstrual dysfunction, males with low testosterone, and or a history of more than 2 stress fractures in females and males. And here are some of the outcomes. For example, I'm on a paper where we had 60% of females and 40% of males with these risk factors highlighted at the top. Gibbs et al., a paper, identified 65 triad studies featuring 10,000 subjects, and the prevalence of the female athlete triad, and therefore REDS, ranged from 3 to 60%. Jen Saigo, another Canadian, she works with elite sprinters in Toronto, found that 30% of female sprinters had symptoms of REDS. Canadian beach volleyball players range from 30 to 60% of REDS scores. These are males. Canadian figure skating, 100% of the athletes this registered dietitian had worked with had multiple risk factors, but it was a smaller sample size. And in Canadian gymnastics, again, around 30% of those athletes also had risk scores for REDS. And when we think about that, the major potential negative initial outcome of REDS usually is a stress fracture, stress reaction, and that most of those injuries take you out of training for 4 to 8 weeks. This can have a profound impact on outcomes of training adaptation and performance and health. More on that later. So again, I'll pause there before I move on and talk about performance and injury illness outcomes. And I just want to stop and see if there's any questions on the diagnosis part of REDS, or any questions that any of you might have on how best to assess or be aware of REDS in the athlete cohorts you work with, excuse me. I see someone just typing there. Anything related to the effects of binge eating? Binge eating can be an indicator of other binge purging, and not always, but sometimes binge eating comes with binge purging or bulimia. And so that is definitely something to just be aware of and to look for. In some instances, binge eating is just poor dietary planning throughout the day, which is a very inefficient way to get your nutrition. For example, we know that spreading protein throughout the day is much more efficient for muscle protein synthesis than back-end loading it all at the end of the day, as an example. The other risk factor that I should have highlighted is orthorexia nervosa. Orthorexia nervosa is a concept of ultra clean eating, or obsessive compulsive eating around clean foods. And that is another risk factor, again, for REDS. Is there data on percentage based on age of athlete, for example, under 18 years of age? Yeah, great question, Christine. There are 2 times in athlete development, there are 2 times as we age as humans where we lay down the vast majority of our bone mineral density. One is when we're very, very young, at the ages of between 2 and 5 years old. And the other time, again, is during puberty. And if you're in poor energy availability during your puberty years and you miss laying down those extra the extra bone mineral density, your peak can be 20 to 40% lower than someone else who is an optimal energy availability during puberty. And you'll forever be at risk and increased risk for stress fractures. And probably as bone mineral density wanes throughout your life, be in osteoporosis much earlier in your life than if you are healthy during your teenage years. So those teenage years, especially in females who have lower bone mineral density, are absolutely critical to having a healthy, functioning skeletal mass as you emerge at the other side into the senior years and senior athletes. And so I'm unaware of published data, but I would suggest that the REDS rates are higher in our junior and development and PSO level athletes than in our senior athletes, unfortunately, due to self-selection out. I see less REDS in our senior athletes. I'm not saying zero, but unfortunately, a lot of athletes have had multiple stress fractures and are out of the sport at that point, and they don't even make it to the senior ranks. Trent, if funding wasn't an issue, how would you go about testing, diagnosing? Great question, Joel. On the Podium has actually put forward a large research agenda, and I have a postdoc, Dr. Ida Hakira, coming, and I'll show some of her data later. I was her co-supervisor. She's coming over from the Australian Institute of Sport to do a postdoc starting this fall for 2 years, and we're going to try to ambitiously try to run a national Canadian REDS assessment program that features more extensive blood work. But if funding wasn't an issue, I would love to be able to have extensive blood work that included male and female sex hormones, so testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. I would include some of the thyroid hormones in there as they're early indicators of REDS as well. It would be great if we could get baseline bone mineral density on every single athlete, as it's pretty static. We wouldn't have to do that often, just to know, again, that risk factor, as well as fill out several questionnaires that are emerging as being good assessment tools for REDS. I believe that medical workup could be done for about $300 to $500 an athlete. So it's not overly prohibitive, but it does take some funding. So yeah, thanks for that. And I see John and Joel just typing. And I'll pause and answer the questions here on diagnosis before moving on to the next section. Yeah, Joel, how often do you think the endocrine panel would need to be done? I would suggest that if you had an athlete with a very low REDS score, it probably only needs to be done once every couple of years. If you have an athlete who scores high risk for REDS, then I would assume and hope, and most physicians would agree, that they would add those sex hormones and endocrine hormones onto MSP or public health care because they're abnormal. And then you might want to check 2 to 3 times a year that hopefully they're recovering and that your interventions are indeed on track. What is considered low sex drive and low testosterone in men? Good question. Most total testosterone cutoffs are in males a value between 10 and 30. However, interestingly enough, in a paper we published a few years ago now featuring Olympic level runners, males with lowish testosterone, so testosterone's under 15, which aren't clinically low, but they were lowish, had 5.5 times more stress fractures in their career than males with testosterones over 15. And so it was just the lowest quartile. We have to realize that blood work and the clinical norms of blood work are just based on normal people. They aren't based on world-class athletes. And so that's a clinical finding, not validated yet, but something very interesting to consider is I look at lowish testosterones a little more with a little more of a raised eyebrow now after our study. Low sex drive is probably just a change from normal, and it's uninterest in sex, uninterest in anything in that space. and is probably a change from what that individual's normal is. And that's a little bit of a harder question to ask. I'm a pretty straight up open person, and I don't usually have a problem asking that, but I can appreciate in some contexts that may be a more challenging question. Great, I will now move on to the REDS performance, injury, and illness outcomes section. And I thought I would start with this paper that's now quite old. And in this paper, they did use energy balance because energy availability was just an emerging concept at that point. What is great about this paper is they use 62, so every single one of these lines represents one of the 62 elite female athletes, including artistic gymnasts, rhythmic gymnasts, middle and long distance runners. And if I believe, the vast majority of these athletes were at the World Championship and Olympic level. And they did, with the best technology that they could, look at energy balance over the day. And what you can see here is that the artistic and rhythmic gymnasts on average were at about a 400 to 600 calorie deficit, while middle distance runners were pretty neutral as best as you can measure it. Honestly, within a couple hundred calories is pretty good. And perhaps the long distance runners were a little over, but also pretty neutral. And remember, 200 to 400 calories is actually quite small. And I'm going to highlight this later again. In many instances, to treat REDS, it's literally only 200 to 400 calorie difference. What they did as well is they looked at anthropometrics, or percent body weight as well on this. And what a really interesting outcome in this study is, and I've seen this in practice over and over and over again, is the leanest cohort is a cohort in the best or closest to energy balance or optimal energy availability, while the cohort with the highest adiposity or highest percent body fat was the cohort actually trying to restrict the most. And this makes sense from an evolutionary biology perspective, where if you're in starvation mode, your metabolic and hormonal milieu changes into that of storage, as storing body fat is a very efficient way to save energy during starvations or during famines. And so it's an interesting outcome, and it's an outcome that I think is very important to highlight. What's also really great about this paper and about this study is we cannot judge a book by its cover. The leanest athletes are in very good energy balance. Well, the athletes who actually have the highest adiposity are in trouble. And I see a lot of us, coaches and athletes, practitioners, make big assumptions on what an athlete's energy availability or health status is, inappropriate assumptions, based on just a visual check of body composition. And obviously this data would refute that. And the study found the number of hours with energy deficits greater than 300 calories, which isn't that great, is positively associated with increased percent body fat. So an important paper to consider. Another paper, this one in swimmers, talking about training adaptation and performance. And in this paper, they took 10 junior elite female swimmers, and these swimmers were split into two groups, as either they were categorized as they had a normal cyclic menstrual cycle, so they were eumenorrheic, or they were ovarian suppressed. So in other words, they did not have a menstrual cycle. What does that look like? Here's your estrogen and progesterone over 12 weeks. Every single month, you see it go up and down as normal. When you're ovarian suppressed, you get no response. They then assessed energy availability and energy balance as best as they could in these athletes. In the athletes with a normal menstrual cycle, or they were cyclical, you can see energy balance right on 0. So energy intake equals total energy expenditure. And energy availability up here, up here is at plus 1,500 calories. So they have lots of energy available for normal body function. In the ovarian suppressed, they're at negative 500 calories of balance, or their energy availability left over after training was only 500 calories. What's interesting, after 12 weeks, when they looked at 400-meter swim velocity, so velocity is speed, the higher the better. After 12 weeks of training, all athletes with a normal menstrual cycle improved their velocity, so they got faster. Well, every single athlete that was ovarian suppressed actually went slower after 12 weeks of training. This is a swim outcome. So when it comes to having negative bone health in swimming, the outcomes are a little bit less compared to runners where stress fractures occur. But here's an example of just straight up training adaptation being impacted because there's just not enough energy left over to allow for optimal muscle and protein synthesis and optimal recovery. Here's an example in rowers. 4 weeks of heavy training led to low energy availability. This is a published paper a few years ago in Olympic rowers from Australia. The athletes in the farthest, lowest energy availability had lower resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate. They had performance declines and increased fatigue. Finally, I thought I would show some of our work. This is Ida Haikura, who I said is mentioned is coming to Canada a few months from now. And we did a massive study over 3 to 4 weeks at Flagstaff, Arizona that featured 27 females and 21 males, of which a quarter of them were 2016 Olympians, all of them as runners. And we looked at bone mineral density, and indeed, there is significantly lower bone mineral density in amenorrheic females, so with menstrual dysfunction, compared to eumenorrheic females. In our males, we had normal testosterone and low testosterone. There was no impact on that in terms of bone mineral density. And then we looked at number of reported stress fractures over an athlete's career. Now, let me explain this graph. Red means 2 or more reported stress fractures. Black means only 1 stress fracture, and white means no reported stress fractures. So what you can see here is in the amenorrheic females, which is 37% of our cohort, and males with low testosterone, 40% of our cohort, had significantly more stress fractures, 5.5 times more, in fact, compared to their healthy counterparts. So that was a major finding here in terms of the impact of low energy availability on bone health and number of stress fractures. We also did an analysis looking at blood health using hemoglobin mass. And I'm going to start on the left side here. So at baseline, when the female athletes arrived at altitude, so they're going to altitude to get more hemoglobin mass or more red blood cells. At baseline, females that were amenorrheic had 8% less hemoglobin mass than females with a normal menstrual cycle. When we just looked at the response of altitude training on increasing hemoglobin mass, as you go to altitude, you get an increase in red blood cells. Over all of our females over the last 4 years, we've shown a 6% increase in hemoglobin from an altitude training camp. Just to put this number in comparison. In other words, athletes are spending thousands upon thousands of dollars to go to altitude for 3 to 4 weeks to hopefully get a 4 to 6% increase in hemoglobin. When amenorrheic females, if they were just willing to chronically eat a little bit more, could potentially have 8% higher hemoglobin just by having a consistently healthy menstrual cycle. We have to remember our red blood cells are also proteins, and our red blood cells also turn over. I don't have time tonight, but just 5 days of low energy availability decreases muscle protein synthesis by as much as 20%. And that can include mitochondria in the muscle for endurance athletes. And here we're showing, for one of the first times in the elite athletes, a compromised hemoglobin mass and compromised blood outcomes from indicators of reds as well. So I'll stop there. There's lots of other performance and injury data I could have shown, but I picked out the key elite athlete studies and some studies across different types of sports to show that, again, this isn't just a female runner problem. Reds can impact across all sorts of athletes and all sorts of sports. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions on that last bit before going on to the final section, which is just a little case study. Yeah, Joel, good question. Do you have any data on responders versus non-responders? So this would be whether athletes responded at altitude that were eumenorrheic versus amenorrheic. Indeed, in this paper here at the bottom, we did that analysis. In fact, at altitude over 3 weeks, the response to altitude was the same in eumenorrheic and amenorrheic females, which was contrary to our hypothesis. However, upon further thinking about that, red blood cells have a lifespan of about 100 to 120 days. And we only measured a snapshot over 3 weeks. And so we believe the baseline chronic impact here of eumenorrheic or baseline values of hemoglobin mass probably represents more of the chronic outcome, while the 3 week pre to post measurements were equivalent in both cohorts. Now that said, the percent increase was equivalent, but obviously the eumenorrheic females went up even further because they had a higher baseline. So good question there. All right, so the last section here is a case study, and I've purposely chosen this case study, and I've chosen not an extreme example of REDS. This is an overt, subtle example of REDS in a male endurance athlete, just to show that in many instances, REDS can go undiagnosed or untreated. So I've blinded this, but I have some blinded blood work of a male marathoner from 2013 and 2014. And you can see here drops in hemoglobin occurring. We can see here indications of clinically low free and total testosterone and indications of dropping ferritin, plus reported and continual symptoms of high fatigue over many, many months. Also, a history of several stress fractures, as well plateaued performance probably for a couple of years. So I was brought on board, and we did as best as we could a 3-day dietary record. Again, this is really challenging to do. And you can see this athlete's 66 kilos. Again, they're a marathoner, so he's not that tall. And he's consuming 4,000 to 4,200 calories a day, which actually is a pretty solid amount. And when I do the energy availability equation, this male athlete's coming out at around 40 calories per kg per day, which is pretty good and pretty decent for males. So on first assessment, I'm not thinking this is an energy availability or a REDS issue. However, as I worked and dug into this a little bit more and was working with this athlete, after digging in a little bit more, this athlete reported that they don't like breakfast. They haven't had breakfast in probably a 2 to 3 year period. And in many instances, they'll do a large workout off a cup of coffee in the morning. And sometimes their first meal of the day, excuse me, wasn't until about 10 or 11 or in the morning. And so basically what we're looking at here, because that's coming off of sleep, is every single day a 12 to 15 hour stretch, every 24 hours without any calories. And again, this is March 2014. So what did we do is I just worked with this athlete to find ways to increase caloric intake by 300 to 500 calories a day. And there's lots of websites with pictures of what that might look like. And I'm going to be honest, 300 to 500 calories a day on any given day is not that much. But you'll remember from some of the other studies, like the swimmers or the gymnasts, that just 300 to 500 calories a day can have a profound effect on body composition and stress fracture risk and training adaptation. It's subtle and small. And so we'll look at adapting their plates for hard training days versus easy training days to really look at ways to just slightly increase 200 to 300 calories a day. In this instance, it was really easy. It was just working with this athlete over time to slowly have them appreciate and increase breakfast as they were not doing that. A few years later, a couple of papers were published, interestingly enough, by the group out of Norway, looking at how midday negative energy balance or midday poor energy availability can also be an outcome for Reds. And Alice Hutchison wrote a great article in Outside Magazine called The Scientific Case for a Big Breakfast. And again, this is 4 years later after the case study that I'm talking about. In this study, there was 31 male cyclists, and 20 of them had suppressed metabolic rate. So when they come into the lab and we measure resting metabolic rate. Interestingly enough, there was no overall difference in calorie intake between those with normal and suppressed metabolisms. However, the athletes with suppressed metabolism and symptoms of Reds tended to spend more hours each day in significant caloric deficits of more than 400 calories and had larger peak caloric deficits. And previous research has shown hourly energy deficits are associated with hormonal disturbances in females and menstrual dysfunction, even when total calorie was the same throughout the day. So again, more evidence of spreading calories throughout the day is really important. And so Alex, and these are Alex's figures from that great article, he showed a great theoretical figure on energy balance, and that the critical threshold for an energy deficit might be as little as 300 to 500 calories. And if you skip breakfast or have a very small breakfast, you're already in an energy deficit here just after breakfast, and obviously in the afternoon after a really hard workout, versus when you consume a large enough breakfast and maybe don't back into your eating throughout the day. Here in the purple line, if you have an adequate breakfast, you can see maybe just after your afternoon workout, are you in that negative 400 or 500 calorie deficit. And so again, just, having a slightly larger breakfast, and in this instance, a smaller dinner, and just titrating your calories out throughout the day has had and can have a profound impact. And that's exactly what our recommendation was with this athlete 4 years prior. So going back to this athlete's outcome, here's his original blood work with all the deficits. And here's the athlete's blood work 3 and 6 months later. You can see his hemoglobin has rebounded back up quite significantly. His testosterone have nearly doubled from 30 up to 55. And we also had him on a iron supplement, but his ferritins have rebounded nicely. Interestingly enough, his sum of total 8 skin folds actually went down. And I've seen this over and over again without a significant change in body weight. In other words, he put on muscle mass and got leaner. This might sound counterintuitive. This male athlete added 500 calories a day at least with breakfast and got leaner. But that's because primarily he doubled the amount of natural testosterone. Testosterone is banned for a reason, folks. And if you look at what testosterone does, it increases lean muscle mass. It helps with recovery. It helps with adaptation. The number one way, in my humble opinion, to have adequate sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, which impact on recovery, is primarily through adequate and optimal energy availability. Interestingly enough, this athlete's marathon performance over a several year period went from 222 down to 215, approximately. I changed the numbers slightly so that I can still blind who this athlete is. But that's, and I don't at all want to say that the correction of Reds here was the sole contributor to this athlete's marathon performance. Not at all. He was a dedicated athlete, had a great training program, but you can see hemoglobin values like this compared to here, or ferritin values like this compared to here, increases in testosterone, a decrease in injuries, all help contribute to a significant jump in performance. And I really want to finish off with this concept. Is just 250 to 500 calories per day really that impactful? Here's some pictures. Here's what 200 or 200 to 300 or about 300 calories looks like in terms of breakfast. Here's what it might look like in terms of a blueberry muffin. One serving of recovery from BioSteel is 250 calories. Again, we're not talking a lot here, folks. And if you're out on any one single day, it doesn't matter. But let me propose this to you. If you're out 300 calories per day for 365 days a year, you are out. Your body is out 110,000 calories. It's like telling an athlete to not eat for 4 to 5 weeks. And that's what REDS is. It's a subtle, small, in most instances, small caloric deficit that just ticks along day after day, day after day, day after day, until there's a problem. And in many instances, and extreme problems are incredibly hard and challenging to correct. They can take several years. But again, I've seen unbelievable RED success stories when athletes are patient. So I will stop there and thank you very, very much. If there's any last questions on that last section, I'll stay on for a few more minutes here and can try to answer them. But thanks for the great questions en route as well.
Looks like Dawn has a question there for you, Trent.
Yeah, what about the psychological resistance to eating more? I have probably been a little bit cavalier in suggesting how easy it is to just eat more. It is incredibly challenging in some instances when there's disordered eating or overt eating disorders to change behavior. This is the number one thing why a multidisciplinary team is so critical. And if there's 3 people on that team, 4 people on that team that need to be absolutely on board with the athlete, it's a physician, a registered dietitian, a psychologist, and the coach. And they all got to be completely on the same page to help support and encourage that athlete to change behavior. And changing behavior, if you look, I'm way out of my scope here. I'm not a psychologist, but I've read enough of the lay literature is and can be impressively difficult. So in many instances, we'll try to make goals that are smaller at the start. So for breakfast, it might be, we'll start with a couple hundred calories and then move from there. Or we'll start with more calories on easy training days so that athletes don't have stomach upset, because there's some evidence that you can adapt your gut to calories before exercise and training. So it is tough. Yeah, Christine, absolutely. If REDS is suspected, first and foremost, hopefully you have a sports medicine physician that you can contact. Sports medicine physicians are much more aware of the REDS literature, and they can help diagnose REDS. Dare I say as well, a lot of the REDS symptoms are very similar to overreaching, overtraining symptoms. And when you look really closely at the literature, I'm not sure overtraining actually really exists. I might call it under recovery. And that 95% of the under recovery is perhaps under fueling. And I think that there's a large under fueling factor to overreaching, overtraining. Cassidy, how specifically would I go about calculating my energy expenditure? I'm not sure I would suggest trying, unless you're a professional on this podcast or on this webinar, trying to measure energy availability, which is energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure. It is incredibly difficult and challenging to do. It is incredibly variable. Instead, about halfway through my presentation, I listed a whole bunch of other secondary outcomes, and I would focus on those things first and foremost for a REDS diagnosis. So things like amenorrhea or loss of menstrual cycle, loss of sex drive, inconsistent training, large changes in body composition over time. These are all really big REDS indicators. The assessing energy expenditure is really challenging. There are equations online. You can use MET tables. If you're a cyclist and you can get maybe slightly more accurate measurements from a wattage meter on your bike, but even there it's challenging.
I think we'll answer just Claudia's question if you
Can you?
can, Trent, and then I'll summarize it.
Yeah, that is a. Can you sue a coach for improper weight loss protocols, especially during puberty? Huh. I don't know how to answer that. I am unaware of that happening globally yet. I am aware of a lot of train wrecks in that space. There is a lot of misconceptions through puberty around the impact of body composition and performance. We need to be really patient with our athletes and really think long term. There's a lot of misconceptions about just body weight and performance. For example, men run faster than women. Male cyclists are faster than female cyclists. Who weighs more? Men. So if you were to actually plot just body weight and performance across cohorts of males or females, you get the exact opposite relationship of what some people think. What I'm getting at here is body weight is irrelevant. It's body composition in comparison to health, first and foremost, and then the force and power that the athlete can produce out of their muscles that impacts performance. And that is really important to think about, and discussions that probably only need to happen with the elite of the very elite. We should be thinking about wholesome nutrition and recovery protocols with our young athletes, giving them guidance around how to manage their day and their lifestyle with school and social media and all these other things before we start thinking about making recommendations around manipulating body composition without professionals involved. So, Claudia, I would be happy to see that happen sometime, to rattle the cage. I'm not sure if that could happen because I'm not a lawyer. And can you talk about how you go about making your energy expenditure estimates during training with national team athletes that we work with? We actually don't do it very often, again, because it's incredibly messy and difficult to do. The only time that we do it is usually in a few cases. One, when we're running a study. Two, in more extreme cases of REDs. So some, maybe not a red, but I'll call it a dark orange assessment of REDs. And it depends on the sport. So for example, if the sport is primarily power-based and we have a wattage meter, we would do a step test indoors, get metabolic data and heart rate data, and then you can calculate off a power file quite accurately what exercise energy expenditure is. We can do estimates of that on for rowers on ergs as well. Beyond that, unless we used double label water techniques, which I've never done and never published with, although we might in the next couple of years, we just do rough estimates and then look at all the secondary indicators. So Genevieve Lalonde asks, for dealing with REDs, would you in general recommend a snack with more protein? REDs tends to be decently agnostic when it comes to macronutrients in general. However, there's some indicators that in fact carbohydrate might be slightly more impactful for treating REDs than the two other macronutrients of protein and fat. But I would take calories over no calories any day. And so, yes, but I would take carbohydrate calories over protein calories, if that helps on that question.
All right, Trent, thank you so much for answering those questions, and thank you guys so much for involving yourselves in this presentation. I hope you all took away some knowledge in relation to energy deficiency. I have recorded this presentation and I will be releasing this session in the next few days. It'll be on our website, csipacific.ca, under our on-demand webpage. So stay tuned for our next speaker series. Trent, thank you so much again for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your wisdom and knowledge around this important topic.
No problem. Thanks so much for the engagement, everyone that was online. That was awesome.
So registration's open for our next speaker series on our speaker series webpage. It's about fueling on a plant-based diet. Is it the key to high performance? On behalf of CSI Pacific, I'd like to wish you all a fabulous evening. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.